So now we're coming to the last guest speaker for our conversation today in session one of the 20th anniversary Wall Street Green Summit. Aisha Williams is the founder and CEO of ImpactVest, an impact mission-driven firm focused on creating an impact investing ecosystem that supports investors and startups to drive purposeful impact change. Good morning, Aisha. How are you today?
I am doing great, Paul. Thank you.
Good. So, Aisha, we're going to get into the topics that you and I wanted to discuss in a moment, but why don't you give our audience a little bit of background as a follow-up to Julia's uh, presentation on your history within sustainable finance and your experiences as well.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Peter. It's really nice to be here and among all the panelists. And so my background, I'm really excited to speak today because my background actually started as a U.S. Boren Scholar in the Foreign Service. So, and that led me on the journey to found ImpactVest. And I wanted to touch upon that today because we speak about the SDGs as a framework a lot in sustainable investment and impact investment. But do we actually speak about the stories behind the SDGs? And this is what I find is lacking, right, in sustainable investment, because we know about the SDG financing gap. It was 2.5 trillion pre-COVID. Now it's raised to 4 trillion, right? So, but what do those numbers actually mean? So I wanted to just talk about some field notes, if I use a foreign service term, out when I had to go out in the field and when we speak about no poverty and clean water and clean energy and climate change, right? There were many farmers I spoke to whose crops were completely destroyed by climate change, and often in frontier markets, emerging markets, crops are a source of savings, right? And so if your crop is wiped out by climate change, how are you going to feed your family? How are you going to save for your family? And those are very, very common stories that I found in the Foreign Service. Also, the top of girls' education, that's not spoken about enough, right? There have been so many areas across the world, girls are completely locked out of working and just going to school, primary school, right? And so these are topics I think when we speak about the SDGs and we speak about sustainable investing and the rise of SDGs, we really have to think about, well, who are the actual stakeholders affected, right? What is the other side of the equation? So I spent about 8 years in service, and it really put the seed in my mind. How can we actually get financing to people who need it the most, right? And it really goes beyond the SDG financing gap, because financing, I think, is just the tip of the iceberg. It really is a systematic change, and we've spoken about this already. It's systemic. It's the way that we live our lives. It's our lifestyles. I think about when I was in China, I toured many factories, and it makes an impression on you when you see the nets, when you talk to the workers in the factories, and these are where our phones are made, right? And so you think about just what surrounds you every day and what choices that you're making. And that, I think, we all have to be more conscious, right? So when we speak about sustainability, it's really important to think about, well, if you make a purchase, for example, if there's a shirt for $2, then you're agreeing with the fact that someone along the value chain is not being paid a living wage to make that t-shirt, right? That might not be your intention, right? But I think it's very important to be conscious of this. And so that was really the experience that I had in the foreign service, right? It wasn't what I thought. I thought I would make much more of a difference, but at the same time, it was really important for me to listen to the stories and to really see that there's a huge need for private-public partnership, and also the private sector. There has to be a consciousness of, when we speak about sustainability, we have to go beyond metrics. And that really led me to found ImpactVest, because I speak about it as an impact ecosystem, because I believe that it's a journey. We are on a journey to find out, well, how can we actually drive positive change through the SDGs? And I think that's an individual journey. I think that that's something that we are always going to be on the search of. I think it takes, like I said, a lot of partnerships between the private and public sector. But I also think it takes really a consciousness of the models that create our financial system in the first place. So this is what I'm focused on, just in terms of the frontier of impact investment and sustainable investment. I'm particularly interested in blockchain, AI, and NFTs, right? I'm really interested in this because what the logic behind them is, it's transparent, right? It's outside of the fiat currencies, and it is a way to get financing to those who need it the most, right? But speaking about the models that make up our financial system, there are models I think of, like if we take the classic models, we're going to pretend that we're in a classic world and we don't have QE. And so if we take like the time value of money, right? And we think about the concept of time, accelerating through time, then what if we integrate ESG and impact into these classic models? Because we're speaking about ESG integration on a very top level, on a portfolio level, right? But what actually has to happen is real integration within the models themselves. So if we think about impact and the acceleration over time, right, we see that if we don't solve a problem now, it's only going to get worse over time, right? But do we have that concept of actually that it's so pressing for us to solve the SDG challenges? Like I started off with my experience in the foreign service. Because I had these really on the ground experiences, they never left me, right? I went into the private sector already knowing that I was going to go into impact investing and that I wanted to find solutions that really addressed the financing gap, right? But do we have this same idea in the actual models that drive our system? Like if we speak about alpha and beta and our kind of classic models here. So I think it was mentioned before by one of the panelists, we've had such a focus on shareholder value that we've forgotten about stakeholders, that the real economy has served the financial markets instead of the other way around, right? So even if there's a rise in sustainable investing, the underlying financial model is still geared towards shareholder value. So how can we really deploy capital in a way that closes the financing gap if our underlying models are not geared for it? If we haven't really changed our models toward integrating ESG into the models in order to really bridge the financing gap and get it to people who need it the most. So that's what I'm interested in, especially with the rise of sustainable investment, because having the on-the-ground experience, it was clear, I think Peter said it was 100 billion in ESG. On the ground, there is completely no sign of that happening, right? So there is no sign in any rise in sustainable investment. So there's a huge gap between what is actually seen on the ground in frontier emerging markets and the rise of sustainable investments. And
Aisha, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second. You're bringing up a very important point that I think is part of this whole topic of systemic change and systemic level integration of sustainable investing. And that is that the human capital side of the equation is often not considered at a deep enough level. And for a lot of people, especially people in developed economies, it's hard for them to even imagine the struggles that people in developing economies go through just to be able to feed their families and have a roof over their head. So what are firms like yours working on that will drive opportunity into this whole, deeper into these developing economies as well as the developed world?
well, we are actually working on three initiatives at ImpactVest. One I'm very excited about, which is an app connecting impact investors with emerging market entrepreneurs by the SDGs and sustainable values, right? So a play on values-based investing through an app, right? So they match together and they can speak to impact investors who are interested in what they're working on. And that really came from the idea in the Foreign Service that there were lots of entrepreneurs in frontier emerging markets who had incredible ideas on how to solve the challenges in their countries, but they just did not have the ecosystem set up to either meet impact investors or they either had to reskill, right? And that wasn't available to them. So there are lots of ecosystem challenges that have to be solved there. But first, I think to really match investors and entrepreneurs together by sustainable values. That's what we're working on. And in our Sustainable Finance Advisory, we are working on an impact dashboard from the corporate lens, right? So if we speak about the real economy, and if we speak about small businesses that form the backbone of the economy, right, it's really important to build dashboards and build frameworks that align them also to sustainable values, right? And so again, getting away from top-down portfolio metrics and getting into the corporate lens and getting into the startup lens, right? Going from the bottom up also, right? But it's very important to not forget about small businesses here, right? Because they are very important to think about when we want to align to the SDGs and the sustainable values. And when I mentioned blockchain and AI and NFTs, what I'm very interested in is uh, if there could be a kind of token or currency that could be either programmed for impact investment. I'm very interested in this because I do think that the frontier of impact investment is going to be in AI. It's going to be there, right? It's just a factor of how is it going to be done? What is it going to be look like? I do think that takes a public-private partnership there, but I think that's the frontier when we're looking at really getting financing and funding to those who need it the most. But it's also an ecosystem issue. I want to point that out because there are lots of entrepreneurs who know how to solve the challenges in their countries, but because of the ecosystem, maybe the country that they're living in, it's very hard for them to get off the ground.
Often in developing economies, in my experience working with United Nations Capital Development Fund, the issues that are at work on a day-to-day basis are ones that can be addressed with existing technologies, for example, cell phone banking technology and communications across markets and getting products and services into the hands of consumers who want them, but they just don't know how to source them. Is there any application there for things like AI and blockchain in the integrated communications collaboration that it takes to get goods and services into the hands of consumers who need and want them?
Yeah, and so I think it really depends on the country, and I do think there are many initiatives in Africa that is really the startup up and coming place for blockchain technologies, especially fintech. Right, there are a lot of fintechs coming out of Nigeria. And I do think that the solutions though are going to come from local knowledge. So I think it's a moving away from a concentration of capital and knowledge, let's say in the Western world and Western Europe and North America. I think there has to be more of a recognition that local knowledge of the market is very, very important, right? It's almost as important as if we're speaking about the rise of sustainable investing, right? Because they really are the ones who know what is best for their own economies and how to deploy it in the correct way, right? So it's really the local knowledge of startups, entrepreneurs, companies that is going to inform, I think, how we address the SDGs, right? Because even with ImpactVest, I'm highly aware. I've worked in the Foreign Service, but still, I am from Chicago, right? I actually, I can have all the experience that I have in the Foreign Service, but someone who's actually living in that country and born in that country, they are the ones who know how to solve those challenges. And so that's really the frontier that I'm speaking of, is we speak about the rise of sustainable investing, but we also have to acknowledge and recognize and value the knowledge that is in frontier emerging markets, and we really have to value what they have to tell us, right? And we can't come with knowledge of kind of a top-down knowledge of how the financing kind of should be, you know, sourced to certain companies. And so we really have to say, okay, well, how do you think that we can actually work with you to solve the challenges in your countries?
How do you see that unfolding related to the topics that we kicked off today's session with, and that those are related to energy and energy infrastructure on not just in the US, but on a global scale? Peter and Sheila talked about some of those issues that we're dealing with related to the pandemic here in the US and the developed economies, as well as developing economies, and how integral is that energy distribution type of network related to the developing economies as well?
Well, I think it's highly important. I also think it's very important in terms of the development of the ecosystem as well, right? Because often when we're speaking about emerging markets, the ecosystems are not really set up to support entrepreneurs who can actually scale, right? And so if you bring in innovative solutions to their countries, it strengthens the ecosystem. So I'll kind of use that term a lot, because we forget that a bit in the States and Western Europe, is that the reason that we can come up with solutions is that because we have a supportive ecosystem around us to be able to do it. And
Right.
so if you have entrepreneurs who are missing that, it's very, very hard for them to scale. So I would say that would be the most important aspect of bringing clean energy in. Well, is that it supports the ecosystems toward sustainability, and then it allows other entrepreneurs to also scale.
What other types of opportunities are you developing through ImpactVest? I know that you spent a number of years working with investors as well. And how has that influenced the way that you're looking at what you'd like to do with your firm?
So I would really like to think about sort of just sustainable investing as the way that we should invest, right? Because even when we speak about sustainable investing, it's still very binary, right? And it implies that there's another way to invest, right? So it goes along with creating a new paradigm of sustainable investing and saying, well, as soon as you make an investment or a transaction, you make a choice, right? So your money, your capital is actually being deployed, and and it's going towards something. It has an impact, right? And so that's the idea that I have with ImpactVest, is with our framework and our metrics dashboard and our app, and thinking about blockchain and AI, is really creating a new paradigm of actually how do we think about investing. So that's what I'm going towards. And I'm hoping that that is the future of sustainable investing. And one day that we don't even have to use the term sustainable investing, right? So that's what I'm hoping,
Okay.
that we go towards this.
I have one more question from my generation to yours, and that is, how are people of my generation becoming or needing to become educated about these new technologies so that we can not only support what you're doing going forward, but we also can deploy capital into the development of businesses?
I think your experience is highly valuable, and what I always say is that it's really important to have partnerships. I think that's one of the things that my time in the Foreign Service taught me very well. That it's important for us to all speak. We all have different experiences, and I think, for example, you've seen kind of the rise of sustainable investing, Paul, and I think that's really interesting in terms of speaking about how the mindset has changed. There are different products, and I think that the conversation is very important to know, to be able to kind of guide us who are looking on the frontier, and then maybe we can speak to you and speak about, well, what are some of the roadblocks that we might encounter, right? What are the patterns that you saw in the rise of sustainable investing and ESG? So I think that's important because we're on a really great track and making great progress, but at the same time, I think it's important for all of us to speak and to really share our backgrounds, experiences to make sure that we keep going in the right direction.
So thank you very much, Aisha Williams, the founder and CEO of ImpactVest.